All right, so the Azure Cloud Shell. I love writing code. It's one of my favorite things to do as an IT professional. I fell in love with PowerShell when it first came out, and PowerShell's been a mainstay. Move out that last bullet point. Azure's been PowerShell's been a mainstay of my life since it came out. I actually got asked to write the first course for a training center when it was called Monad. So I've had a lot of experience with PowerShell as a consultant. I literally use PowerShell every day. Still to this day, I use PowerShell almost every day. So the Azure Cloud Shell is like awesome, and we're going to see how awesome it is. And the lab's great about introducing you to the Azure Cloud Shell. It's really cool. It's directly integrated to your Azure environment. So it's super, super awesome. And we're going to be taking a look at all these aspects, and you see on the slides behind me in this particular section of the class. In order to use the Azure Cloud Shell, you're going to need something called a workspace. So you'll be prompted the first time you go to create one to create that workspace. And essentially what you're creating is a storage account and a workspace for it to have its own file share and place to put stuff. Why does it need that? You might say, well, let's take a look real quick. I'm going to go to my demo machine, and I'm going to go ahead and, well, I could do it right from here. I'm going to go to my home page of Azure. You can open up a direct connected Azure Cloud Shell, by clicking on that PowerShell icon. That's the PowerShell logo anywhere. So if I'm over here in Azure Resource Mover and I see that icon, I can open it up there. I just need to be able to see that icon. That's one way of opening up the Azure Cloud Shell. So I'm going to click on that icon, and right below the Azure portal, it opens up an Azure Cloud Shell. It opens up a session. I can even kind of move it up like that. And then I have these tabs across the top. I have switch to PowerShell. Make that again. Switch to PowerShell, restart, manage files, and I have this kind of the up and down section. That means upload and download. And this is the reason that you need to have an Azure storage account for the Azure file share. That is the file share. It automatically will start my location. So it automatically signed me in because I'm already signed in, and it automatically connected me to a location. And that location is that file share. And if in the terminal, if I click LS, these are all the files that are currently in my Azure file share. I've got some JSON files. I've got some bicep files. I've got a couple of other different files, a PEM file, a couple PEM files. So this is all in that file share, and that's what I need. I need to have that. And the first time you go to launch, it's going to create it for you. And I can interact with that either through the command line, or if I click this drop down, I have the ability to upload or download to the file share, or I can click this open file share, and then it will up in the portal area. Get up here. Up in the portal area, it will open up to that file share. It's got this weird name. If I click on this directory, it doesn't really give me like the files in the file view. There's actually an Explorer view that you can use to look at that. So maybe the web preview. No, never mind. All right. So that is why they need to have that. It's just for the first time, it's going to need to create that because you'll interact with that. There's two flavors of the Azure Client Shell that we're talking about here. One of them is uses PowerShell, and then you'd be in a PowerShell session. And then the other one uses Bash. Bash is the default scripting language for Linux or Unix. It really comes from the Unix world. And if you're using the Azure CLI, using the bash commands, then you use the bash syntax. If you're doing it with PowerShell, you use the PowerShell syntax. And you can literally switch between those in the session. So I'm going to come back over to my demo machine. Let me make this bigger. Right now, I'm in the bash version, and I know that because I know that because of the command ls. Actually, PowerShell will support that too. It supports aliases. But I'm in the bash session. If I want to switch to PowerShell, I can click switch to PowerShell, and it will say, all right, it's going to connect to the same container with the new PowerShell session. Any processes running in the active bash session will go to the background, and I'll click confirm. So if I had a long running script, technically it would still be running, although I honestly would be nervous to do that. They're asking me to take a survey. I'm not going to do that right now. But what I'm going to do is now it says building your Azure Drive, and now I've got this. So if I say dir, this is a PowerShell listing of all of those different files. And so there's just different ways of doing it. I'll say cd cls for clear screen, or clear dash, I think it's clear host is the technical term. And if I do ls in PowerShell, it still lists them out. PowerShell supports a lot of crossover, but bash is not so friendly to PowerShell commands. So really, this is a direct connection to my environment. I can get to any of my resources right from here. I just need to learn the commands to do that. And there's several ways to kind of help you with that. We'll talk about that throughout the class, but right now we're just trying to introduce these topics. All right, so, there we go, I zoomed in. So that there's a bash version and a PowerShell version, and that's the Azure CLI to get started. Now, one of the things that you'll probably be working with if you're working with the Azure CLI is the automation of objects or environment. The question is, does it create a storage account for each user per subscription? Ooh, that's a good question. I believe that is per subscription. I'm almost positive about that, Anas, but even though you can't see what I'm doing, I'm gonna copy that question and I'm going to put that into the parking lot, because I think that's an awesome question. I believe it's per subscription that the user has to have access to. However, I want to know that. So I just added that to parking lot. Great question. Why is it not in Office 365? CLI PowerShell is available, but not for Exchange commands. I don't know, Brett, why they don't have it available. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. But if you've worked with PowerShell for a while, you know that, let me put myself in the screen here. If you work with PowerShell for a while, then you'll know that the way they did is they rolled this amazing tool out, and then they told each of the product teams, whatever your administrators, well, I don't know the specific verbiage. I don't know what they specifically said. I'm not reading a script, but they communicated to their product teams, whatever your administrators can do with your product, they need to be able to do with PowerShell. The one product team that I think probably didn't like that was probably SQL, because they have so many built-in stored procedures for the management of SQL, but they still did it anyways. IIS team did it. Exchange team did it. At the time, the Link team did it. That's kind of morphed into the Microsoft Teams commands. The SharePoint Online team did it. The SharePoint On-Premises team did it. So they all had to implement these commands, these ways of using PowerShell to administer their product, in addition to providing a portal or a GUI way of doing it. And at the time, all the teams said, all right, they got their marching orders, and there was kind of a variance on how each of the teams implemented their PowerShell solutions. They all worked, but some of them used something called remoting, where you would create an object called a remote session, and you'd hydrate that object with the properties that were required for that session, your login and endpoint, things like that. And so some teams didn't do that. Some teams gave you more of an experience like connect to Microsoft Teams or connect to SharePoint Online, or whatever the commands were to connect. And then you could just start, if you had the authority, you could just start writing your commands. Other people did the remote session type of deal. The Exchange team did that, and I think the Link team also did that, which was Skype for Business at the time, that part of it. Anyways, so every team made their own commands to manage their products. And then Microsoft, as the cloud just exploded, they said, we're going to unify that and we're going to create something called the Microsoft Graph. The Microsoft Graph is an insanely complicated but awesome. Complicated on the back end, but super simple on the front end, kind of. And they created a commonality to access all of the cloud resources using the Graph APIs. So instead of having to learn the SharePoint commands and connecting to the SharePoint module and running SharePoint Online commands through that, you could just connect to Microsoft Graph, pass in the scope of permissions you were going to need, and then you could use the Microsoft Graph API to access and interact with all the products that your permission scope that you passed in let you do. And it's more of a unified approach using Microsoft Graph and Microsoft Graph PowerShell. And Microsoft is saying, like, we want you to start using Microsoft Graph PowerShell for everything. For some reason, the CLI feels like it's just kind of on its own right now. And the CLI was really Azure specific, meaning the Azure objects, Azure groups, and it's expanded, but it sort of didn't really, as far as I know, go into SharePoint Online or Exchange Online management. It's kind of like does its own thing. I haven't seen any indication that it's going to change. You can download and run a local copy of the CLI if you're going to use the CLI locally. It has installers based on your operating system, and you can install it like that. So, Brett, I hope that answered your question. But that's as far as I know why that is. I don't know why they've decided not to include just the CLI everywhere, including the admin screens and the compliance center and all that. But that's where we're at right now. So I'm not sure why, other than just giving you sort of that background. All right, so ARM templates, Azure Resource Management templates. Microsoft is a big fan of helping those organizations and those admins that want to leverage automation, DevOps, continuous integration, and they're really trying to support that, and they are supporting that. And one aspect of that is describing your IT environment or your resources, your resource groups, any level all the way down to individual resources and settings about them, describing them declaratively. And this is part of what we call doing your IT environment as code. And that's really what a lot of the aspects of true DevOps is representing and managing your IT environment as code. And the way that we describe things in Azure is an Azure Resource Management template. So as you create resources, it will create this JSON description of your whatever you're creating. And then you can download that, like I mentioned, and then you can reuse that. You can edit it. You can use that as a description of what you want. And then you can use the Azure CLI to implement and apply those templates in code and deploy all your stuff consistently. Because if the template is consistent, you use the same template to create 1,000 things, they're all going to be compliant with whatever the template is. So earlier, demo machine, if you remember, I had that resource group and I downloaded that template. So notice it came down as a zip file. I'm going to right click that and go to properties. And I'm going to click unblock to let my machine know you're safe. This came from the internet. I know, but you're safe. And I'm going to say extract all. And I'm going to browse to my desktop. And I'm going to extract that file. And when I do that, here is my template.json right here. It also brought down something called a parameters.json file. And typically I like to open these with Visual Studio Code and edit them with Visual Studio Code, but they're just text files. So if I click open with, I can choose Notepad, and I'll say just once. And it looks just like it does when we browse it here. It says, okay, this is the schema that's going to be used, and this is informational for Microsoft. That's actually a bit of an older schema. And there's some properties down here. RG name, resource group name, type of that is a string, and RG location. This is a schema defining what data it should get. And then down here's the data. Microsoft resource groups, API version, location, here and here and here, and then outputs objects. So this is the template JSON file that was created when I created that resource group, and then I downloaded it. And that is the type of thing that you can use in the Azure CLI, is you can use those ARM templates, and then you can leverage those to create your own environments using code. And so if I come over here, here's an example of a template. You can, a lot of times what you'll do is you'll actually get templates and load them up. You'll upload them, and then typically you'll do a little bit of editing as required, and then you'll save that, and you'll kind of have little variances of your templates. There's a couple questions. Brett, got that? Okay, Brett, yeah, thanks. Been doing local PS. Would have been nice otherwise, right? And then Miguel, if I'm unable to connect to my organization's Graph API, could it be due to missing permissions? Yes. That's exactly why you would be unable to do that. 100%. You are missing permissions. So that's a good question. Keeping up with the slides. In addition to the template file, typically there will be a parameter file, and the parameter file can be used to leverage things that can be applied to the template file to allow you to have variances. So you don't want to have 1,000 resource groups and they're all named the same thing. It won't let you do that. So you could have a template file that goes through and updates that particular name and put it into a template file. Like, hey, look at the template file for that deployment. Same thing, you can edit those. They're JSON. You'll get very familiar with those parameters and template files if you, when you do the labs, not if you, when you do the labs. Now, Microsoft has created an amazing language called Bicep. The idea of Bicep is they said, look, in using infrastructure as code, it disconnected my session over there on my machine. I just happened to see the pop-up. If we're going to use infrastructure as code, then this is a lot of lines of code to describe something, and a lot of people that are doing this are not developers. They're not web developers. JSON's a little bit hard to read sometimes. So we're going to invent a language that's easier to read and that's easier to learn. And we're going to call it Bicep. And it's amazing. It's called a domain-specific language, or DSL. It uses a declarative syntax to deploy Azure resources. So the idea is that actually this is a strongly typed language, and the Bicep files can do the same thing with, at this point from working with Bicep, and I'm loving Bicep, by the way, it could do the same thing as an ARM template with about between 1/3 and 1/2 as many lines of code that are easier to read, especially once you read it. Now, just Jordan said, just to clarify, the template is the schema and the parameters, the actual details of the template. Is that right? No, there are different ways of looking at that. So let me go back to this. This is a parameter file. So here's a template file, and this one is saying, let me look at this one right here. So you got, these are the parameters that this template file will accept, and it's saying that it takes a VM name, and there is a default value and then default description. And so It depends on how to answer the question, it depends on how you configure things. Personally, I have deployed resources without a parameters file. So just using either just a bicep file or a template file. And it was just a one-off, so I didn't leverage that parameters file. So it's possible, it depends on how you configure the file. Does that make sense, Jordan? Just to make sure. But typically the template file is going to be the main part. And then within the template file, you say, well, this is a parameter, look to wherever it's getting the parameters. Typically, you pass in the parameter file to pass in with your template file. Hopefully that makes sense. But yeah, that's a good point. For the most part, yes, but I have deployed resources just using just a template file as well. At least with the bicep, I've done that. And I've been trying to stay personally in the bicep side of the house because I feel like it's super fun. I don't feel like I've mastered it yet, but I'm getting a lot better. I'm loving it very much. Jordan, did I answer your question, by the way? So the parameter file, I'm assuming, modifies different settings not included in the template file. The template file, in the template file, you can declare parameters, and it's going to, if it goes to a property that it says is declared as a parameter, use the parameter name, it's going to look for a parameter file. And if it finds it, it's going to match whatever you have in that parameter file for that property. Okay, cool. Thank you. Awesome. Got it. Thank you, Jordan. Kilo, is there a way to grant admin consent to an Azure application for Graph API permissions using PowerShell when the admin consent workflow is configured? Okay, Kilo, I'm going to come back to that when we're talking about managing applications right now, because I want to stay focused on this topic, but I'll go ahead and pop that in the parking lots just so I don't forget to bring your question up when we get to the applications, if that's okay, because I want to get that goes into application management, which we do cover. That's okay. All right. Okay. So bicep files are behind the scenes. They go through something called a transpilation thing that happens. And that is, it actually transpiles or converts behind the scenes your bicep file to an Azure Resource Management template. So the template specifications, Azure Resource Management template specifications. I recommend that you do research this article, Azure Resource Manager template specs. But before you get super absorbed into searching and things like that, the topic of Azure Resource Management templates and the topic of bicep, the understanding of that for the level of the exam is covered between this discussion, where my goal of this discussion is to introduce you to the basics of them, and then knowing that you're also going to be going through all of the Microsoft Learn content, which is going to go into the nitty-gritty details of things like this. And then you're going to be doing labs where you're going to be doing quite a bit of steps using resource manager templates, parameter files, interacting with the Azure Client Shell, uploading files to that and editing them. So you're not going to get everything you need for the AZ-104 from just this. You need to do this and then do the Microsoft Learn content and then do the labs. And on the other side of those three things, I think you're going to feel comfortable that you are in a good place with Azure Resource Management templates and Bicep and the Azure CLI, because there's a lot of that in the labs and a lot of that in the content. So this is like, it's a trifecta, and you're getting exposed to the first part. I'm not expecting you to walk away today and go, oh, I got it. Azure Resource Management templates. Got it. Yeah, template files. This is the introduction. This is part one of a 3-part series, and you do the other parts. All right, the Azure Cloud Shell demo time. So I'm going to go to my demo machine. Before I jump into that, Kilo, I'm going to copy this question, put it over in the parking lot. boom. And when we get to the applications section management, I'm going to come back to that. That's a great question. All right, so getting back to, Ibrahim, what is the difference between quick start template and template spec? I don't know. I think a quick start template is one that's already pre-configured based on a resource. That's my guess. I'm not sure of that one. Let me put that in the parking lot too. See, but I'm pretty sure that's what it is. Okay. All right, so getting back to this demo. So I'm just going to do a little bit of Azure CLI. I'm going to say open up an Azure CLI here, a Cloud Shell. It kind of remembers what I was in last time. And I'm going to do, is it interactive? I think it's interactive. I'm trying to remember. I believe it's interactive. You'll know what I mean if I get it right. All right, I'm gonna switch to Bash, confirm, and then I'm gonna say AZ interactive. I believe that's the word. Boom, boom. Okay, this is a newer or in preview shell, but it's meant to help you to learn the Azure CLI, and what's doing is it's loading a recommender, which is, it takes a minute to do, but I'm really enjoying this AZ interactive shell for learning, for if I'm not sure about the commands. Typically what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here and I'm going to say Azure AZ CLI commands, except I'll spell commands correctly. And I'll make sure that I have, Microsoft Learn. So the Azure Command Shell interface. Let's see, I'll click here. And there's an awesome page. I'm going to actually put this into the chat. And in this article, I have how to download it if I want to run it locally. You don't have to run it locally. This is if you want to, okay? And then run it in the Azure Cloud Shell, run it in a Docker container. There's different ways of running it. Right now, for me, I do both the shell, the Bash and the PowerShell version in a direct session in a Cloud Shell, but I also download it in Windows and I also run it on my terminal as well on my dev machines. So they have this onboarding cheat sheet. If I click that onboarding cheat sheet, I've got some information about the CLI. I've got some commands, and then I've got using reference commands, information. Is this the one down here? Reference index, list of all commands, boom. And then here's all the commands. I'm also going to put this into the chat. And these are the Azure commands, Azure CLI commands. This is a list of the commands and what you can run and how you can, I think these almost, there we go. Azure, these are different categories of commands. Okay, so boom, Azure Bicep. These are different commands there. Anyways, I'll let you research those. I want to get back over here. By now, the interactive shell has been installed. Now, this interactive shell is a little bit interesting. I find it a little bit hard to read with their color schemes. But what I want to do is I want to say AZ VM. See, it's giving me like autocomplete. And I like that. I like this, especially when I'm first learning. So these are the options I can put in this section. So I'm going to say list, except I'll spend it right, list. And I'm going to put a space. I'm in the bash version right now. And then I'm going to say dash output space table. This is so hard to read, and I don't know why they chose that color scheme. AZ VM list output table. In Bash, you pass in parameters with a dash. In PowerShell, you would just use one dash, so there are some differences. Oh, I didn't paste the link. Thank you, Ibrahim. That's not the one I want, though. I gotta go back. This is it. No, I pasted this one. Azure CLI. What other one? What did I miss? I missed something. The cheat sheet. The commands. Using reference commands. And then I'm sorry, I missed the commands. I'll get that later. I should just be like, I just want to see the commands. Well, this is good. Learning the CLI tutorial. I'll put that here. Begin your CLI journey. This is a good one right here. I'll paste this command instead. Okay. Oh, thank you, Mitchell. But I'm also going to put this. This is a good one too. All right. So getting back. So I'm over here. What's my time looking like? Cool. And this output table, and I got to scroll up to have it be, is really easy to read. I asked it to list my VMs and it gave me this output that had the name, resource group, location, and zones. If I just do the native AZ VM list and I don't put output table, it still gives me the results, but it gives me the results as JSON. Okay. So you can get all kinds of information. You can switch to PowerShell, and then you can get help with PowerShell and learn the PowerShell commands and run PowerShell commands as well. And just generally do whatever interactions you need to do with the Azure CLI. So the takeaways from this at this point are that there is an Azure CLI, that in order to run it directly connected, it requires a workspace. It will make you do that. I believe it needs one workspace per subscription, but that was a great question, whether it's per user. I'll find that out. And then you can do it in either PowerShell or Bash mode. You can use ARM templates, and you can use the quick start templates, which have predefined environments. You can use parameter files with your ARM templates. You'll get a lot of experience with that if you do the labs, and a lot of information about that through the Microsoft Learn content. You can start to learn and use Bicep. Behind the scenes, your Bicep files compile to actual ARM files, but it's a step you don't have to deal with. You just deploy your Bicep files, and the Azure engine takes care of that for you. And then there's different specs about the different templates, and I did an Azure Cloud Shell demo. And again, it's a trifecta. So you're going to want to take this, like this is like the introduction, and then you'll go through the Microsoft Learn content and do all the labs. And again, I don't know if you remember, but I recommend doing the labs 2 or 3 times, okay, each. If you do these labs 2 or 3 times each, read the Microsoft Learn content after this lecture, you'll feel very comfortable with all the different pieces, and you can like explore your questions as you go through that. You'll be like, okay, now I have a different set of questions. Kind of everything makes sense because you've been putting a lot of stuff together.